It's a nice day. Nice weather.
Beautiful.
Okay, Gilbert, whenever you're ready to begin.
Okay, let me get this up again here. All right, okay, let's get started. All right. Welcome to our special meetings, Chapter City Council, Tuesday, May 12, 2020. Call to order at 4:35 p.m. and roll call. All council members are present. And may I get approval of the agenda?
I so moved.
I'll second.
We have a motion by Councilmember Prout and second Pro Temp Lopez.
Councilmember Prout,
Yes.
Givens,
Aye.
Lopez,
Yes.
Garcia,
Yes.
and Alvarado.
Yes. All right, moving on to public comments. This portion of the meeting is reserved for persons wanting to address the council only on matters listed on this agenda. Yasmin, do you have anyone wants public comment time?
No comments were received to the city clerk email or by mail or phone call.
Okay, all right. Public comment is closed. We're on to manager's report. It's the budget workshop fiscal year 2020 to 2021. And I'll pass it over to City Manager Gonzalez.
So, Mayor and Council, this evening we have two items to present to you. Both are just for, there's no action we're being requested. They're for discussion and direction. And first item is proposed budget and fiscal policies. This is update to our budget and reserve policy that we want to discuss and cover with you. The second item is related to our general fund operating budget, fiscal year 2019-2020 year-end projections. This portion of the presentation will cover now as we began to dive deeper into the budget. And first, as you know, the process of any good budget preparation is looking at your current fiscal year and estimating your year-end projections of where you think we will land come June 30th. That's the basis of which we then use to build the proposed new budget for the upcoming fiscal year, in this case, fiscal year budget 2020-2021. So part of that process is for us to present to you what those estimated year-end projections are, so they have a good understanding of where we are with revenues and expenditures. That, as I said, will be the basis for how we build the 2021 proposed operating budget. Our budget consultant, Bill Statler, will make both the presentations. This is an interactive process, and that if you have questions during the presentation, we encourage you to please go ahead and ask your questions. And then at the end, will also be a brief Q&A session for any further questions, discussions you may have. So with that, I'd like to again introduce Bill Statler, who has joined us and heading up our budget team in terms of preparing our city budget, along with the other key members of the budget team, Brittany, Rachel, Trevin, and Sylvia, of course. And with that, Bill, I'll turn it over to you. Yes, do we have Bill?
Yes, he's on the call.
Bill, you on the call?
He looks to be muted right now, Yasmina.
Yes. He has no microphone.
Oh, there we go. Well, good afternoon, council and member staff meetings. I'm delighted to join you this afternoon. I realize as a finance professional, I probably have more enthusiasm and appetite for this topic than others do. nonetheless, I'm delighted to share that with you. As the city manager mentioned, I have two items to review with you. The first is budget and fiscal policies, and the second is where do we think we will land at the end of this fiscal year. And of course, that's the kind of an essential component of beginning next year's budget in establishing where we will start from. So, Yasmina, if you would bring up the budget and fiscal policy slides, please.
Sure. Bear with me. One second, sorry about that.
Well, let me go ahead and just begin with some introductory comments while, here we go. Let's go to the next slide, please, Yasmina. Just an introduction, in my experience, in 30 years as a senior financial manager and now 10 years as a consultant, my experience that fiscal policies can be so powerful in protecting a city's fiscal health, both in the short and the long term. It really helps provide an important foundation and framework for decision making. I liken it to your general plan or your zoning code, where when you review projects that are coming forward, you have a framework within which to view those. Now, it could be that you encountered a process or encountered a project that you really hadn't intended upon, and you might very well maybe change your land use or your zoning policies accordingly, but at least you have a framework within which to evaluate those. And really, budget and fiscal policies provide a very similar framework as you have to make case-by-case decision-making about your finances. Next slide. Because I think the best metaphor for this is fiscal policies are like your own personal health, physical health. It isn't what you live for, but it's hard to enjoy your life without physical health. At the end of the day, and I know this is a rare thing probably for a finance officer to say, but cities don't exist principally to be fiscally healthy. They exist to be cool places for people to live, work, and play. On the other hand, in providing the services that people want, you have to have the fiscal financial capacity to achieve those goals. In short, fiscal health is not an end of it in itself, but it's an important tool in achieving, desired community goals. Next slide. And like personal health, fiscal health is rarely luck. There are certainly those people that have great DNA, great genes, stories about I smoked a carton of cigarettes a day, 2 fifths of whiskey, and lived to be 96. Yeah, it happens. But on the other hand, if you have a healthy diet, if you do regular exercise, pay attention to your cholesterol and blood pressure, you're more likely to have a long, healthy life. Next slide, please. And just like your own personal health and your own DNA, if you will, having clear fiscal policies and most importantly, following them, it's the best way to ensure long-term fiscal health. Just like your own personal DNA, obviously the local economy is important. And as we discussed 2 weeks ago at our briefing, you're really fortunate in Shafter. You have some really great fundamentals in place, but that no one is immune to economic downturns. And at the end of the day, no matter how good your economic DNA is, if you will, financial management counts. You have cities like Beverly Hills, Palo Alto, Santa Monica, that you would otherwise think have great economic and financial DNA, but they're really struggling right now. And how they work their way and how they navigate through that is going to be all about their financial management. It's not going to be about the underlying strength of their economy. Next slide. And importantly, having strong fiscal policies, it's important in both the good times and the bad times. Next slide. Because if you think about it, for most cities, the roots of fiscal adversity, they take place in the good times when things look really positive, and many cities, Shafter not among them, they make decisions that are going to have long-term implications based on how things are at the time, and they make commitments that really aren't going to be sustainable in the long term. Next bullet point. Few cities get into more trouble in the bad times because most cities follow the first rule of holes, and that's when you find yourself in one, stop digging, which is kind of the next bullet point. Again, most cities recognize in the bad times they have to take some sort of action. It's really the decisions you make in the good times that's going to determine how you enter the bad ones that will inevitably come. Next slide. And they're both preventative and curative. If you have clearly articulated policies and you follow them, that's going to help prevent problems from arising to begin with. And when the good times and when the bad times do arrive, they're going to help you better navigate that. No one's immune to economic bad times. No one's immune economically from COVID-19. But how you enter into this as a city in terms of your fiscal strength and the kind of tools you have in place to help you navigate through that, that's going to make a real big difference about what that looks like when the bad times stop. So next slide, please. And they, in my experience, they take on a momentum of their own in terms of guiding the city through good times and bad. Next bullet point. A really critical item. How do you pass the baton? If you have really strong financial management practices in the past, but as council members and staff members change, how do you make sure that baton gets passed? Well, if you have clearly articulated policies and they're readily accessible, that's going to help pass the baton to others that might follow you. Next bullet point. And of course, they're most powerful if you can put them in place before the need for them arrives. Best to kind of keep the horses from getting out of the barn to begin with. But even if that happens, having policies or having a policy framework is going to help you corral those horses and get them back in the barn if they do get out. Next slide, please. Policies can play a critical role in your financial management. They're the North Star, if you will, in guiding the preparation and implementation of plans and budgets. Most importantly, they help make tough decisions easier by telling you what your values are and how you think you would approach this kind of issue before you're placed under stress. You might actually do something else. Maybe you hadn't anticipated this particular incident. Like, I know very few policies, for example, on reserves. Many of them will talk about economic downturns. Many of them will talk about natural disasters like floods and fires, earthquakes. Until now, I don't think very many policies talked about public health crises. COVID-19 is really the first type of public health challenge to finances that we've really seen in probably 100 years since the Spanish flu. So you might actually do something else, but at least you have a really strong starting point for asking yourself, but for this thing I hadn't anticipated, what did I think I would do? And at least it provides a framework for answering that question. Next slide. So our focus in looking at budget policies is really on policies that will help us frame and prepare the preliminary 2021 budget. And those 4 items are budget purpose and organization, revenue management, reserves, minimum fund balance, which we'll talk about in a minute. You already have a really excellent policy on that. And then financial reporting and budget administration. Next bullet point. There are other policies that, based on those that recommend best practices, like the Government Finance Officers Association of the United States and Canada, user fee, cost recovery, investments, appropriations limit, managing your capital improvement program, purchasing, handling pensions and retiree health care, productivity, contracting out, and perhaps more than that. These are other policies that other organizations have and that are recommended as best practices. And those can certainly come as a new administrative services director comes on board and as your new city manager gets even further engaged with the city's financial management. But the policies we're recommending at this point really focus on those 4 on the left-hand side of the screen, because they're going to really provide the foundation for putting together this upcoming budget. Next slide. So here's an important part of budget purpose and organization. Most organizations talk about having a balanced budget, that it's their policy to have a balanced budget, but what exactly does that mean? And as you evaluate your financial condition, both in communications to the council, the organization, the community, if you say you have a balanced budget, exactly what does that mean? So we're proposing in the budget and fiscal policies that we define that. And the first item is that operating revenues should fully cover operating costs. And in your case, that would include debt service. You don't have any in the general fund at this point, but you could at some time, as well as your commitment to revenue pass-throughs. We'll talk about those in a bit. But these really represent kind of your ongoing commitments, and you want to make sure you have ongoing revenues that cover those. And you want to make sure that your ending reserves meet your policy minimums or whatever other target you set in the budget as being the reserve position you want to have. And what that means, next sort of sidebar, if you will, click. This is an important note. This means that in any given year, you might very well spend more than the revenues that are coming in. And you may be drawing down on reserves. That doesn't mean you don't have a balanced budget, but it does mean that whatever you're drawing down on reserves should only be to fund capital improvement plan projects or other one-time uses. Your current revenue should match your current operating expenditures. It is okay to draw down on reserves as long as you're using those reserves for one-time purposes. Next slide. And the other one is to really focus on the effort that almost virtually all city organizations, no matter how involved or simple their budget is, typically consumes a lot of organizational time, consumes council time to review it. I can assure you it consumes a lot of time on behalf of the city manager and the finance department. So why would you put yourself through all of that effort if there isn't a significant policy goals to be gained? And ultimately, all budgets are about linking resources with goals and results. That may be an intentional process. It may be an unintentional process. But at the end of the day, you're only going to get accomplished what you funded. And hopefully, you have allocated your resources to the highest priority, most important things to do. So from my perspective, although there are spreadsheets and there are, detailed analysis that go on in building the budget, it should all be geared towards how do we effectively link resources with important community goals and with results. And so there are kind of 5 things that should happen as part of the budget process and as part of the budget document. And the first is, of course, we should identify what kind of services the community wants us to deliver. And then secondly, organize programs around delivering that, whether it's public works street maintenance, whether it's the police department in arresting bad guys. Then you want to make sure you describe what those programs look like and the kind of activities you perform in delivering those services. Importantly, you want to identify those objectives that you hope to accomplish in the coming year. They're going to help you improve service delivery. And then ultimately, what the budget is all about, if those are the services you've identified, you want to make sure that you've linked the resources that each of those programs, that each of those departments, with the services and the goals that you want to accomplish. At the end of the day, it's about linking the resources you have available, which are always limited, with the most important things you want to accomplish. Next slide. And once you've set those goals and those resources in the budget document, then you need to make sure you're monitoring your performance against those. So you want to periodically receive reports from management about how you're doing in accomplishing those important goals. And you also want to make sure you're getting ongoing reporting about how you're doing financially, and that includes having a formal mid-year budget review. Next slide. Revenue management, probably the two key sort of revenue management policies. Again, it kind of ties in with that balanced budget policy. You want to make sure that your current revenues are allocated for current uses, and that if you do have any significant one-time revenues, you want to make sure you're using those for one-time purposes. You want to avoid using significant, maybe one-time refunds or any significant developer contribution or what have you. You want to make sure you're applying those to one-time uses. That could be to build your reserves. That could be to help you fund capital projects. But you want to make sure that one-time revenues are used for one-time purposes. And then secondly, in accordance with sort of generally accepted accounting principles, you have general fund revenues that should be used for any legitimate authorized municipal purpose. And you want to avoid earmarking general fund revenues for a specific purpose. And there may be some cases where that is an important policy, but if that's the case, then you want to make sure your budget policies identify what those situations are and make a clear rationale as to why it's appropriate to do that. At this time, to the best of my knowledge, you don't have any earmarked general fund revenues. So this is really a prospective policy. Again, several of the policies that are here and some of the suggestions I have for them are not to necessarily deal with current issues, but they're to make sure that the baton gets passed. They're to make sure in the long run that this framework is in place for the future. Next slide. And then, of course, the important one, and that's minimum fund balance and minimum reserves. And at the end of the day, you have an excellent reserve policy that you put in place back in 2017 in a formal way. But at the end of the day, if you're going to put reserves away, why? Why would you do that? Next bullet point, please. You know, this is the types of things that cities and other agencies typically set reserves aside for. Local disasters, fire, floods, earthquake. To be honest, I've added this one in about the last 48 hours, and that's public health crisis. Hopefully we won't have another one like this, but quite frankly, you're going to be held in really good stead that you enter into the next budget season with really strong financial tools in place. And we've discussed those. You have strong reserves. You're allocating funds towards cap improvement projects. You don't have any CalPERS or pension unfunded liabilities. You just have a number of strengths as you go into this. Obviously, downturns in the economy. And you could say it isn't the public health crisis itself that's causing fiscal problems throughout the state and the nation. It's the downturns in the economy as a result. And of course, in California, we've had especially big challenges in the past. Back in the day when I was a finance director in San Luis Obispo, and we were in the midst of the Great Recession and other economic downturns before that, my greatest fear was not actually how bad sales tax and property tax revenues could get. It was actually how much money could the state of California take away from us, because I could see some limitation to how bad the economy could get, but I really couldn't see any limitations on the state's appetite to take funds away from local government. Now, we're fortunate we have some constitutional protections from that. We haven't really heard the state of California talk at all in dealing with its own challenges about looking to local government. But let's be frank, how you handle things like state takeaways or unfunded mandates, that's another area where, having strong reserves can help you, at least on a short-term basis, in dealing with those kind of shocks. Next bullet point, please. And then irrespective of what's happening in the economy, you could have unexpected operating or unforeseen capital needs that really weren't on your horizon when you put the budget together, but you had, and I can give you some examples from San Luis Obispo. We had an asbestos roof at City Hall we needed to take care of that wasn't on our radar. We had a bridge that was failing that wasn't on our radar. And having reserves available to deal with those, fortunately they didn't both happen at the same time, allowed us to deal with those unforeseen circumstances while continuing to provide essential services to the community. Next bullet point. Unfunded liabilities. You're really fortunate that you addressed these, but if you think about it, how did you do that in several years back? You did that because you had strong reserves that allowed you to pay down your CalPERS unfunded liabilities. Next bullet. And of course, cash flow, even during the year, there's peaks and valleys in terms of cash flow. If a city is heavily property tax dependent, that's your second most important revenue source. Well, you're not getting those monies for the most part until December. And that means for a city that's heavily property tax dependent, they got to figure out how they're going to run their operations for 6 months before they get that important revenue source. Franchise fees, which are among one of your top 10, you're not getting significant revenues from that until April. And when it comes to things like permit and service charge revenues, you don't have control over when those fees get paid. So just for interperiod, if you will, just during the fiscal year, you may need to have reserves just to help you with imbalances during the year with your cash flow. On a budgetary basis, reserves and expenditures might match, but again, they may be lumpy, if you will, have peaks and valleys during the year, and you need to make sure you have adequate reserves to deal with that as well. Next slide, please. Just stated simply, reserves are really your first line of defense in responding to any adverse, unforeseen circumstances. Next slide. The big question that the cities deal with when it comes to trying to set their minimum target reserves, of course, is how much. And I'll give probably the least favorite answer in the universe and say it depends. It depends on each agency's unique fiscal circumstances. How volatile are their revenues? How dependent on just one or two key taxpayers are you on certain revenues? How even is your cash flow during the year? What types of natural disasters are you likely to face? If you're in a city that has a significant sort of wildland-urban interface, then you're going to want stronger reserves to deal with that than perhaps a city that doesn't have those challenges. On the other hand, if you're a city that's near waterways that are subject to flooding, might want to have some stronger reserves to deal with that. And so at the end of the day, you really have to just take a look at your own unique circumstances. And the other thing you have to look at is your own capacity for risk. If you're a city, this certainly doesn't describe Shafter, but it might affect others, that you're really comfortable with risk. And if something goes south, that's fine. We'll just lay off a third of our police department. No problem. We'll tell everybody they have to go home next week. Or if you're confronted with COVID-19, as some cities are now, Cities that otherwise have, really strong fiscal circumstances, I'm thinking now specifically of like Monterey and Santa Monica, they are immediately beginning to lay off between 20 and 35% of their workforce. If you have a high tolerance for that, you can have low reserves. On the other hand, if you want to maintain stability as much as possible, and you have an aversion to having to do significant unexpected things, then you want to have stronger reserves. Next slide, please. Because at the end of the day, that's exactly what reserves are. They are a risk management tool. How much can things go differently than you thought they would before you have to take remedial corrective action? And let's just use COVID-19 as an example. Those cities that had very limited reserves going into this, they don't have a lot of options or choices, but to do some pretty significant adverse things in keeping with their budget. Those cities like Shafter that have strong reserves, have resilient revenue sources, as we discussed 2 weeks ago, you're in so much better shape than many of those cities. And it's why if your community or council members of the organization are reading about all these other things that cities are doing to address their fiscal situation, and it seems like Shafter isn't doing those things, it isn't because Shafter's asleep at the wheel. It is absolutely because you are in so much better financial shape than 481 other cities in California. So it doesn't mean those cities around you aren't doing what they need to do given their fiscal situation. It just means you don't have to do the exact same things because you're in so much better financial shape. And even if you're facing a systemic problem, which I firmly believe the city of Shafter and other cities throughout the state are not facing, this is a one-time challenge that as soon as the public health crisis is over, the economy will return and return in strength. But if you thought you had a more systemic problem, you can't use one-time resources to deal with that. Ultimately, if you know based on a forecast that you structurally at this point have expenditures exceeding revenues, the only solution you really have is to bring revenues and expenditures back into a line. Nonetheless, having reserves provides a bridge to that future time. It will provide you with time to develop and implement thoughtful solutions so you don't have to do the things that so many other cities are doing in California, and that's immediately slashing expenditures and reducing staff. Next slide, please. So you have an excellent policy in place already. I mentioned that Council formally adopted this policy in 2017. It does address target minimums, and in the general fund, it's 50% of operating expenditures. In your three main enterprise funds, it's 25% of operating expenditures. So you're in sort of a top class of cities, if you will, that have clearly articulated reserve policies. But you're really within a handful of cities in the state that have gone further, and that's not just to find a target. Many well-managed cities have done that, but you've clearly discussed in your policies what the objectives are, how those policies need to be integrated into your budget and financial management, that you should do periodic policy reviews of those. You've identified when the use of reserves is appropriate. If you think about it, many people consider their reserves to be their rainy day fund. Well, if that's the case, then it must be appropriate to use them when it rains, with one caveat, when it rains unexpectedly. And then your policy deals with the other issue, and that is you have these reserves for a purpose. If those purposes surface and you use your reserves to meet those, then what's your policy? What's your strategy for restoring your reserves back to those policy levels? And your current policy addresses all of these, and many policies in the state do not address these other issues, which are also important in managing your reserve policy. Next slide, please. So there are just three areas or I've recommended based on a review of your policies and best practices, 3 areas where I think a little bit of clarification could be useful. And the first one is just clearly articulating the purpose of reserves, and they're exactly the things we've talked about: economic uncertainties, contingencies for unforeseen needs, unfunded liabilities, institutional changes, and cash flow requirements. But to really make those reasons explicit. And then the next bullet point, please. The second item is better defining operating expenditures. Right now, the policy says, for example, in the general fund, that it should be 50% of operating expenditures, but it doesn't really define those. It says as defined by the Administrative Services Director. Now, I know how he has defined that in the past, and it's a good, solid base. I'm simply recommending that we better define that and put it in the policy itself. And that is basically, it should be the operating departmental expenditures. It should be any debt service obligations, if you have any, which you don't have right now. And we should include in that any of your revenue sharing pass-through obligations, because those are really things under your current agreements with some of your major retailers. Those are ongoing commitments and obligations that you have. And so the proposed policy simply better defines how that metric, if you will, how that base should be defined. So there's not necessarily any magic or any black box about when we say your minimum reserve should be 10 million and they're actually 15 million, just as an example. It's clear how we are calculating that minimum reserve target. And the third item, next bullet point, please. And the third item is a little bit of guidance about how you can use reserves below the target. And the first and most important one is, if this is the purpose of reserves on the left side, then obviously it's appropriate to go below your reserve minimum if any of these situations arises. If you have a contingency for, if you have an unforeseen operating need come up, or if you have some unfunded liabilities and you want to use reserves to address it, this says that it's appropriate to use your reserves for this purpose. It also says it's appropriate to use reserves if it's going to help you lower costs in the future. And a really good example of this is exactly what the city has done in the past, and that's drawing down on reserves to pay off unfunded liabilities. What is that use of reserves doing? That's better positioning yourself to have lower costs in the future. And so in that case, it makes sense to use reserves at some level in order to reduce future year costs. So those are the 3 changes. And in the proposed policies you have, what I've done in this particular case to make it clear where your current policies are and where the changes are. If there's any deletions, that's kind of in strikeout in the attachment. And if there's any new language, those are kind of underlined. And what you can see is in that out of a pretty comprehensive policy, there are actually very few suggested tweaks, and these are the 3 among them. Next slide, please. And then the last recommended budget policy, again, these are all things you're doing, but to make it really expressly clear on your annual reports, the goal here is to strive for an unqualified auditor's opinion. That term unqualified is kind of a little unique, I think, to the accounting profession. Unqualified normally means not capable, not talented. In this case, what it means is there's no qualifications on their on their opinion of your financial statements. It means that you're basically getting a clean audit opinion from your auditors. And the language here isn't to have an unqualified auditor's opinion. You can't guarantee that. All you can do is strive to achieve that. Of course, you have an unqualified auditor's opinion, and you have for many, many, many years. But nonetheless, it should be clear that that's what you're striving for. You want to use generally accepted accounting principles in preparing your annual reports, and of course you can't get a clean auditor's opinion if you don't do that. The Government Finance Officers Association, the GFOA, has very high criteria for achieving their Excellence Award. You want to meet those criteria, and in fact you have for the last 28 years. And then lastly, financial statements need to be timely, and the generally accepted guideline for that is audited financial statements shouldn't be issued any later than 180 days after year end. I have to compliment the city again. You are again within a rare handful of, maybe not handful, but in the top 10%, if you will, of cities in California. You actually issued your last audited financial statements in the middle of November. That's really, well before 180 days. And that makes you a rare breed to actually get your audited financial statements out. Quite frankly, very few cities do it before December. And then, of course, it's important to not only have audited financial statements, but you need to be providing and looking at interim reports during the year, because if you're relying solely on your audited financial statements to tell you how you're doing, 18 months could have passed before some really awful things could have been happening in your financial operations before you're aware of them. So you need to have robust, if you will, is kind of the industry term for this, but you need to have ongoing interim reports. They need to be timely. As many people within the organization should have online access as possible. You should be releasing monthly and quarterly reports as appropriate. On key things like investments and sales tax, you can have focus reports on those. Mentioned earlier under policies, you should be doing mid-year reviews, and an attempt should be made at the end of the year. Don't wait 180 days to issue how you did at the end of the year. Try and get out an interim annual report, perhaps by August, so that it's complete. But get out interim reports so you're not waiting until audited financial statements to know how you actually ended the year. Next slide, please. And the last item under this is budget administration. Of course, after the budget's adopted, a majority of council members can amend or supplement the budget anytime after that. But an important caveat here is any new appropriation that's basically coming from fund balance, that isn't simply a transfer between line items or offsetting revenues, but if it's going to be an appropriation from fund balance, that requires council approval. On the other hand, when can staff make administrative revisions to the budget? Well, kind of three caveats on that. A, that it is just an administrative revision. We may be changing the water line item or the budget for that, and we're going to put that into electric bill instead, because in order to better reflect those costs. So it really needs to be focused on an administrative adjustment, which means it shouldn't have a significant policy impact. And again, it shouldn't affect budgeted year-end fund balances. And that's just sort of the yang, if you will, to any new appropriations require council approval. Next slide. I think it's really important to think about what the policy is versus actual. I think for cities that are really well managed, like Shafter, there's probably a tendency to believe, well, if that's our policy, then of course we're following it. And that's certainly the practice. That's certainly the case today, but it doesn't have to be. And so what I'm proposing, and it's in the draft policies that I provided you, that may not always be the case, but you still want to articulate what the goal is, where it is you want to be, because that's going to significantly enhance your chances of getting there. Next bullet point. So what you see here for each of the policies that are proposed in the report, every policy is followed by a short compliance status. How are we doing relative to our policy goal? And it's a simple statement. You're either in compliance with that policy or you're in progress in achieving that policy. But if that's the case, what's the plan for getting there? So a really good example of this would be if in some cases you actually drew down on reserves in a way that's appropriate with the criteria that you've established, well, maybe you will fall below that 50% guideline that's in your policy. But if that's the case, well, what's your plan for getting there? Now, the policy you have says you should do that within 3 years. Well, great. Is that your plan? How are you going to do that in year 1, year 2, year 3? How does the current budget reflect in that goal? And I think this has several really powerful things associated. One, of course, it forces staff to think about this and the council to think about this. It also, by including these policies in the budget document itself and including these status items, it really helps keep those policies in front of the council, in front of the organization, in front of the community, and making sure they aren't just sitting in a spiral binder someplace collecting dust. It helps maybe keep them a little more alive and a little more relevant to the city's financial management. Next slide, please. And probably the sweetest words in English language after the conclusion of a presentation, and that is, does anyone? This is ended. Does anyone have any questions?
Council, is there any questions from council?
None at this time for me.
I have none.
Okay. Manuel?
Yeah, I guess I have one. So, Mr. Beal, so do you just encourage us to keep doing what we're doing by spending 50% of our fund balance always?
Well,
What?
I think the important thing to keep in mind is you have this 50% policy target, and as we'll be talking about in just a little bit, you're going to end the current fiscal year above that target at about 60%. And I think the fact that you've actually, set that 50% item and actually have done better than that, that's going to really position you well to deal with this COVID-19. And you've also used your excess revenues, if you will, really wisely. You've invested in capital improvement plan projects. You've invested in reducing your liabilities. So I think you quite frankly, have done an excellent job of staying the course on this. And again, these policies, as I noted, they're both preventative and curative. And as new staff come on board, as council members change, whatever that long-standing commitment to fiscal health has been, you want to make sure that baton gets passed. And I think these policies, clearly articulating them, putting them in your budget document, will help you really maintain that excellence in financial management that you've demonstrated in the past.
Okay, well, thank you.
Councilmember Proud? Any
No, I'm
questions?
fine. No, I'm fine.
Okay, all right. City Manager Gonzalez?
Yeah, certainly, Mayor and Council, that wraps up this presentation. And so if there's no comment from Council in terms of making any of the proposed changes, we'll finalize these minor revisions to the policy consistent with this presentation, and then we will bring those back as part of the budget adoption, these fiscal policies for you to consider to adopt. Nothing further on this topic. So, Mayor and Council, if nothing further on this, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you could move on to the second item.
Okay, thank you for your permission to continue with item 2. Again, as I said, this next item is related to the general fund operating year-end 2019-20 projections, which we're estimating what our revenues and expenditures will be at 6/30. And as I mentioned earlier, that's what we will use as the basis to develop and prepare the proposed fiscal year 2021 operating budget in the general fund. So I'm going to let Bill go ahead and make that presentation. Bill, please continue.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that introduction. Next slide, please. You know, as the city manager pointed out, we're just taking a focus at this year in the general fund, because at the end of the day, how we end this year is the foundation for how we're going to start next year. And quite frankly, thinking about how revenues and expenditures are going to end this year gets us thinking about what that continued trends might be into next year. And so for the general fund, really taking a look at how our fund balances, how our reserves going to change, how we think revenues will be different from the current budget, and how we think expenditures are going to be different than the current budget. Next slide, please. So let's actually, as we start to think about how we're going to begin next fiscal year, let's talk about how we began this fiscal year. And again, as we discussed 2 weeks ago, you have a really strong general fund beginning fund balance for this fiscal year. The total is 51 million, but that can be a little misleading because you have a portion of that that's unspendable. It's not, it's commitments you don't have them available for appropriation. And then you have portions of that fund balance that you've assigned for other purposes, and a significant assignment here that gives you a lot of flexibility going in the future as well. And that's setting aside about 13 million for kind of planned projects that are in your strategic plan. You're not ready to execute those projects right now, but you wanted to set money aside in order to do those within the next 3 to 5 years. Again, really wise to do that. But even after we allocate these assignments, you have 17 million that is unassigned. And of course, this unassigned number, that's what your minimum reserve policy is focused on. Next slide. In analyzing this fiscal year, there's really kind of 5 items that we took a look at. The first one is, how did we actually do in the last fiscal year as a basis for thinking about the rest of this one. But we also provided what's the current budget as of April, what are the actual year-to-date results as of April, because from whatever we've spent year-to-date, that only leaves us 2 more months to spend any of that remaining balance. And then based on that, what are our revised estimates through the year? And then what's the variance from the current budget? And if it's a favorable variance, it's in a positive number. If it's an unfavorable variance, then it's in brackets. Next slide, please. So here's kind of a snapshot look at a summary of your revenues, expenditures, and changes in fund balance. And the focus here, as we look at fund balance in that bottom line, is not your total fund balance, but it's that unassigned portion that constitutes or is the basis for your reserve policy. And as you can see here in the prior year actual, you ended with unassigned reserves of 7,800,000. And probably the key item here is based on your current budget, where you had a significant CIP, you thought you would end with about 13 million. And yes, here's an example of that balanced budget policy. If you notice, operating is 18 million, and the current budget's 34. So you're clearly covering your operating expenditures with current revenues. But that drawdown of 4.6 million, that's totally related to your capital improvement plan projects and planned capital improvement plan projects. So yes, you were drawing down on reserves in that case. You were still going to meet your policy minimum, but you were using it for one-time purposes. You were using it for capital projects. Year-to-date actual just sort of shows you what your balance was through April, but probably the really critical column here is what are the revised estimates that we have. And you can see that we're projecting you will end with about 15 million in reserves, and that's that represents about 60% in ending reserves. And although I'll talk about this in more detail, the variance for that is largely on the revenue side. It's about $3 million less, but that's more than offset by proposed reductions in expenditures, largely in the capital improvement plan projects. But you end up even in addressing COVID-19 issues, you still end up with reserves at the end of this fiscal year that are a little bit stronger than your minimum reserve policy. Next slide, please. On looking at the general fund revenues, we really focused on your top 10 revenue sources because they accounted for 98% of your total actual revenues in 2018-19. So trying to take a focused look at those top 10 really describes and focuses on almost all of your revenue sources. In addition to that, even though sale of property was a very small revenue item in 2018-19, it was a significant revenue item in the current budget. So we took a look at that. And then there is that small slice of other revenues. So we make sure we're looking at the total. So we're kind of focusing on a baker's dozen of revenue sources, if you will. Next slide. And here's how those turn out. Really, the two most significant revenue items. Sales tax is going to be about $500,000 less than was budgeted, and sale of property is going to be about $3.1 million less than budgeted. And those two combined, that explains that $3.7 million total variance between your current budget and where we're going. And so I'd like to spend a few minutes just talking about these top two revenue items. Next slide, please. So the sales tax variance at almost $500,000. This is projected based on being down 10% from the prior year actual. Just a quick check on this. It's less than this. The budget variance is less than the downturn than prior year actual, because the prior year actual was so much stronger than your current year budget estimate. And I'm sorry, Yasmina, would you go back to the previous slide for just a minute? And here you can get a better picture of this. If you look at the 2018-19 actual column, you'll see your actual sales tax revenues were about $18.7 million. But your budget did not anticipate them coming in that strong, and it only projected $17.3 million in those revenues. So while the revised estimate of $16.8 million is a 10% reduction from the $18.7 million, it's only a $500,000 variance from what was in your budget. And again, this variance is not from your prior actual, but it's from your current budget. Now, let's go back to the next slide. That 10% downturn, again, that's based on an analysis prepared by your sales tax advisor, Avenue. It's a little confusing, and Avenue is less the E, so it's not a misspelling. That's just how they spell their name. But Avenue is your sales tax advisor. They've done a detailed analysis that compares sales tax revenues and the declines from the Great Recession, comparing them to the situation we have today. And then in the city's case, they also took into account your significant sales tax generators, the Williams-Sonoma Customer Care Center above them, and then so try to sort of refine what they were seeing happening statewide with Shafter's unique experience. And so we're taking what we think is actually a conservative estimate for the current year and suggesting it'll be down by about 10%. That's compared to reductions statewide of anywhere from about 25 to 35%. Again, it's reflective of your unique sales tax situation. And it also recognizes that for this fiscal year, you are only going to see the downturns that happened in March, because that's just the lag between when revenues are collected by the state and when you receive them. So if you're thinking that April through June should be a much steeper decline than 10%, it may be, and we'll take a look at that as we put together next year's budget. But keep in mind, for this fiscal year, you're only really going to see the downturn that occurred in the month of March. So we believe that a 10% downturn from your prior year actual is a conservative estimate for the balance of this fiscal year. And then, of course, big variance in the sale of property. And this is related, and this is due to three totally unrelated items regarding the sale of property. The first one is in the budget document itself. It projected $5.1 million in the sale of property. And this was based on estimates from the sale of your old corporation yard, which you're in the process of vacating and moving into your new corporation yard. So it's the sale of that surplus property once that relocation is complete. And in addition, at your new corporation yard, you have some property there that's really surplus to your needs at the corporation yard. And the goal and the plan was to sell that surplus remnant piece as well. Those two pieces of property combined $5.1 million. Those aren't really ready to market right now. They could be potentially sometime during next fiscal year. On the other hand, it depends upon what that market looks like. You're again in the really advantageous position, if you will. If the market's not favorable, you don't have to do a depressed sale. You don't have to sell this property in order to make ends meet. You have strong enough reserves that you can wait for the real estate market to recover, which I firmly believe it surely will within the next 6 months to a year. And so if the opportunity arises and you can market and sell these properties at a reasonable price, then you will do that. If not, then you have the ability to hold on to that. But that's the first piece. Those properties are not sold now, and whether they sell in the next fiscal year, that's not a sure thing. And so you would otherwise, if this was the only property transaction or the only revenue projection, then we would be showing this as being down by $5.1 million. But there are two offsetting items to that are completely unrelated to that $5.1 million revenue estimate that's in the budget. And that is the actual sale of property of about $810,000 that you consummated in either December or January of 2019 or 2020. So that is a sure thing. You have $810,000 sitting in your bank account from that sale. And you're currently in the process and negotiations are far and away, and this is in accordance with your budget as well, for the purchase of two properties under which you actually have a memorandum of understanding with the Shafter Parks and Recreation District to sell a portion of that parcel. In fact, the large portion of that parcel, but with you retaining the portion that's on retail portion that's on a major arterial, and you have an agreement to resell those for $1.5 million to the Parks and Recreation District. So that's pretty close to a sure thing. You're in the process of obtaining those parcels in the very near term. And when that happens, the Park District has a commitment to purchase those from you for $1.5 million. So what you have is that $5 million. That isn't going to happen this year and maybe not next year. But offsetting that is the $810,000 in actual sales, as well as a pretty sure thing, $1.5 million. Might not happen by June, but it might. But in either case, whether it happens in June or July or August, That's 1.5 million. That's pretty close to a sure thing too. So that's why you get a variance of 3.1 million. It isn't any one thing. It's these three things that have some offsetting sales that weren't envisioned at all in the original budget document. Next slide, please. So now we turn to taking a look at where general fund expenditures are headed, and we've really organized that into three groupings, if you will. What's going to happen to the operating departmental budgets, what's happening with capital improvement plans, CIP projects, and then what's happening with your revenue sharing pass-throughs. Next slide. So as we look at your operating expenditures, you'll see here, basically the larger departments are expected to have bigger savings. In total, about $814,000 in savings, and that represents about 5% of the departmental operating budget. The only one I want to identify is outside of the departmental budgets, you've created an account number to keep track of emergency response costs to the COVID-19. You've actually spent about $64,000 year to date on that. And in really kind of providing more of a placeholder for that, kind of projecting that might be up to as much as $100,000 this year. But in general, as we look at your overall general fund expenditures on the operating side, should see about 5% in budget savings this fiscal year. Next slide. When we look at CIP projects, a couple of notes on this. It's really typical that rather than annual budgets in the case of like operating budgets, where those lapse at year end. If I gave you $1 million budget, you spent $995,000 of that. You have unspent savings of $5,000. That doesn't get carried over. That balance just goes to the general fund balance. On the other hand, for capital improvement plan projects, which often span more than one fiscal year, it's really typical that those are accounted for based on project-linked budgets. And in fact, your charter recognizes that and calls for and recognizes that appropriations do not lapse at year end for capital projects. They really are in place until the capital project is completed. And in those cases, what's typically done, if you had $1 million budget and you spent $900,000 in the current year, we would carry over that $100,000 balance. That reappropriation would not require council approval because you already approved the project budget of $1 million. So, and you'll see that happen throughout your financial reporting, where you might see that the budget for the current year was $1 million, but the next year the balance gets carried over, so it could well be higher. But we are proposing that we take a different approach in this coming fiscal year, based on the fiscal challenges facing us, as well as we want to make sure that we have the organizational capacity to manage the full range of capital projects. So rather than simply carrying over all of the unexpended project balances, and in some cases, you don't have any prior year expenditures and you don't have any expenditures this year either, that we're going to take a fresh look at the priority of those projects where there are no current commitments. Now, that doesn't mean that those projects that didn't get launched this fiscal year are not going to get carried over or not get recognized in future year CIPs. It just means we're not going to automatically carry over those balances. We're going to have the staff and the council take a fresh look at those priorities as we allocate our limited resources to those. Next slide, please. So here's a summary of what your capital improvement program looks like. And here's just in the prior year actual, kind of gives you a snapshot of what the likely continuing projects are. And the most significant ones there are the courtyard relocation, the finance systems replacement, that's ERP, enterprise resource planning. That's a continuing project. And you can see there where in the prior year, you actually spent $9.2 million on projects. That's a pretty significant chunk. And drawing down on reserves to fund those projects, that's a lot of the reason for the drawdown in 2018-19. This is your current budget, which includes your new projects as well as the continuing reappropriations from projects in the prior year. So your current budget for all of your general fund capital projects is actually about $12.2 million. And of that, through April 30th, you've spent about $2.6 million. And through the end of the year, including your commitments, we're seeing that there will be expenditures or commitments of $7.9 million of that we want to keep in commitments, either that we will spend through April 30th, either through June 30th rather, or that we know we will want to reappropriate funding for. And that's your Alliance site development agreement, lease agreement, option to sell. You're committed under your agreement there that if Alliance wants to construct shops on that property, you're obligated to do that construction. He's indicated his interest in moving forward with that. So that's not exactly a financial commitment. You haven't led a contract for that yet, but you certainly have a legal obligation. Land acquisitions, as I've talked about before, you've already completed one land acquisition from the Wilson Family Trust. You have $2.1 million in acquisitions that are currently underway. So we need to commit funds for that. Courtyard relocation is still in process, so we need to commit for that. You've already need to commit to completing out any existing Americans with Disability Act access improvements. Job center access improvements, you acquired the land, and now it's time to actually begin the street improvements for that project. And again, you need to complete the ERP replacement. That leaves, and unfortunately, at least on my screen, it's covering up these variances. But what it leaves you with are projects that are not going to be automatic, whose balances are not going to be automatically reappropriated at year end, but we're going to take a fresh look at as part of the 2021 budget. And that's actually $4.2 million. Now, it's entirely possible that all of that could get reappropriated if that's where the highest priorities lie. But that's a new budget decision, if you will. So at least through the end of June 30th, 2020, there should be about $4.2 million in savings from the current budget. And that is one of the significant offsets to the potential revenue downturns. Next slide, please. And then the third component making up your expenditures are agreements you have with some key sales tax producers to share sales tax revenues with them. While certainly determining how much needs to be shared, the agreements themselves do not specifically say that you will be sharing sales tax revenues with them. They say you will be sharing any general fund revenues you have available for that. So rather than showing that as a reduction in sales tax revenues, which might be how some agencies would have handled that, because it's not directly a reduction in your sales tax revenues, but rather a general fund commitment to sharing them, they are accounted for as an expenditure item. That's traditionally reflected about 48% of your total sales tax revenues. And so in this particular case, since we have reduced sales tax revenues, there will be reduced pass-throughs as a result. And what that means is we're projecting about $8.1 million in pass-throughs versus the budget estimate of 8.4 million. And that's the last kind of expenditure item that we were focused on in estimating where you're going to end the year. So next slide, please. And just to kind of capture the steps that are outlined as part of this budget process, we've already, through the end now of this study session, hit three of the key areas where in helping to build the foundation for the budget. And that was the strategic planning workshop that you had in the middle of April, where you set top priorities for the coming year. April 28th, where we talked about strategic budget direction, some of the key principles, if you will, in preparing the budget. The study session we're having today. And then the next step will be issuing the preliminary budget on June 1st, and then a series of council workshops in June following that, leading to council adoption by June 30th in accordance with the city charter. Next slide. And now we're to the end of the presentation. Take questions. I do really want to emphasize this. Again, although there will be challenges in putting the 2021 budget together, you will enter into the new fiscal year in really good fiscal shape. Both certainly compared to 481 cities in California, but even by your own policies and even by your own reserve standards and balanced budget policies, you go into this in a very strong position. So, I really want to reiterate this. There are many cities, I'm sure, around you, many cities through the state of California that are appropriately responding to this as a financial crisis. And they're doing really serious slashing in order to respond to that. You're not doing that, not because you don't understand the seriousness of the situation, but because you have so much better preparation for this. You have so many ways of addressing this from a position of strength that because of your past policies, because of your past actions, you're just going to be able to get through the next 6 to 9 months in much better shape than really many cities throughout the state of California. So I'm sure what all those many cities that are around you throughout the state are going through is absolutely what they have to do based on their own physical circumstances. But because of your past actions, those aren't things that you have to do. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions you might have about how we see you beginning next fiscal year.
Is there any questions from council?
I have a question.
Okay.
Yasmin,
Councilmember Powell?
am I back on?
Yes, you are.
Okay. My question is, what do you see? Because up to this point, we haven't seen what the future sales tax is going to mean with this COVID pandemic that we're dealing with even now, that the risk could be even greater when it's lower for revenue, especially.
Yeah, it's again, we haven't tried to take a look yet at what next year holds. But
Okay.
It's really important to keep in mind that whatever reduction we're seeing for this fiscal year is only the impact through March. And so given that, I think that a 10% reduction is reasonable, keeping in mind that it's conceivable, I'm not projecting this to happen, but for internet sales like those occurring at Williams-Sonoma, it's actually possible those could be up, maybe not a lot, but slightly, as people shifted from bricks and mortar retail, if you will, into greater online sales. That could actually mean stronger sales tax revenues from Shafter, not less. Now, that's a very difficult thing to project, obviously, and we won't be able to see whether that's in fact held up or not until the end of June, early July at the soonest. And for the biggest area where we're seeing downturns in sales tax revenues, which is probably the first quarter of the new fiscal year, we won't know what that actually looks like until December at the soonest. So we are entering into a certain period of uncertainty. The thing that I am sure of is the worst of these impacts will probably not show up this fiscal year. They will most likely show up next fiscal year. But that said, one of the strengths that you have, again, you have strong business-to-business sales versus business to consumer. I think those have a chance of holding up better and stronger than other sales tax revenues. And again, you have significant portion coming from internet sales, which could actually do slightly better as bricks and mortar stores shut down.
Okay, the other issue had to do with the oil industry that's going to be tapped for next year. I realize that we were just looking at finalizing this budget session, but even for the next one, to be cautious about what might happen in that oil industry?
Yeah, again, in looking at your unique circumstances, I believe that the county as a whole will see some significant impacts on that. I think you will see maybe some surrounding cities that have impacts on that. But I think the city of Shafter itself will be relatively insulated from that. Again, it just has to do with your own unique economic circumstances that you are likely to be less impacted by that than really many of those in Kern County, which is heavily reliant upon the oil industry, and other cities within the county that have significant oil industry activities. But again, we've looked at that, consulted with your sales tax advisor, and they just don't see the same kind of impacts on Shafter.
Because we already, I don't know what the percentage is that we receive in sales tax from oil-related businesses that should go down. I mean, we've always been very concerned about it. Other cities don't have that same revenue that we have.
Yeah, I think it's really that issue that your sales tax and property taxes in Shafter are not as dependent on the oil industry as many of the cities that are surrounding you. And again, that could be, how can I say this? Let me say this, for this fiscal year and next, your tax rules are fixed. There isn't really, if there is going to be an impact on property taxes, that would happen more likely in 21-22. Your taxes, property taxes for the current fiscal year, that's based on assessed valuations from January of 2019. And your tax rule for 2021 is already fixed based on the tax roll or assessed valuations in January 2020. So even if your suspicion, if you will, or belief that the city's property taxes will be affected by the oil industry, again, we won't see those impacts most likely until 21-22.
Right.
Now, there could be cash flow, and here's where I need to add a caveat to that. There could be cash flow implications to you because the tax due dates have been extended from April to the end of June. So you may see some folks who are, their property tax obligations, in fact, haven't changed, but they're going to choose not to pay their property tax bill on time. And if that's the case, you will see, from a cash flow basis, you will see the implications of that. On the other hand, given your strong cash position, if that should happen, you will more than make that up from the tax payments when they happen, plus interest, plus penalties for having deferred that. So long story short, just don't see big impacts this fiscal year or next on your property tax revenues. Could happen, but if it does, it will be in 21-22.
Right, I understand that. Okay. That's all I have.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Garcia. Councilmember Garcia.
I think that, like Kathy's always said, we're always in a great position, and we ought to thank God and thank the council members before us, and, John Gwynn and Wade McKinney and all them other ones. But thank God that we are where we at, and, just still be careful and conserve things, and, believe in one another. That's it.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Gibbons.
No, good presentation. Looking forward to the next steps. And Kathy, thank you for asking those questions. I had that burning in my mind, so thank you.
Right.
All right, Mayor Pro Tem Lopez.
Great presentation. I appreciate that. And I have nothing else at this time. Thank you.
Okay. All right, thank you. Now turn this over to City Manager Gonzalez.
Mayor and Council, that concludes our presentation. At the next meeting that you'll see related to the budget is the release of the proposed draft budget as required by the city charter. June 1st, we will have that draft budget to you for the review, and then the subsequent meetings in June will be related to discussion, staff presentation and council discussion of the proposed operating budgets for the general fund, special revenue, and the enterprise fund. And then with the follow-up being that we would be asking council to adopt the budget at the second meeting in June. So we're continuing to make progress. A lot of work is going on behind the scenes, and we're fortunate to have great staff, and with the help of our outside consultants, I believe we're well on our way in presenting to you a very well put together financial plan, i.e. our budget, that will be consistent with past council directive, strategic goals. It will prioritize our three strategic goals: public safety, financial sustainability, employee wellness, and we will have some more information to you based on our surveys we've conducted with our community and businesses to maybe add a fourth goal related to business and community wellness, as well as we continue to move forward with the recovery of the COVID-19. So with that, Mayor and Council wraps up our presentation this evening as it pertains to the two items. Nothing further, Mayor.
Gilbert, you still on?
Sorry about that. I just wanted to say thank you very much, City Manager Gonzalez and Bill Stratler and the city staff for putting all this together. It was a great presentation. And we're going to go ahead and move on to recess into closed session. And the first item on the service, and number 2 on that is conference with labor negotiators. I need a motion, please.
Make a motion to move into closed session.
I'll second.
We have a motion by Councilmember Givens and second by Mayor Pro Tem Lopez. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right, Yasmina?
Yes, bear with me.
Hey, Yasmina,
Yes.
my screen is black and I don't know how to get back out of it.
Okay, hold, just give me a
Can you,
second.
can you do it?
I can try.
Yeah, I never had that happen.
Just bear with me, y'all.
That's right.
Okay. Okay. And you should all be receiving a notification to enter into closed session, and you accept that. Okay?
Yeah, but I don't know that I can do it because there's nothing
Yeah,
on
I
mine.
haven't, just, it will come to you guys very shortly.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Can you hear me? It's Manuel.
Yeah, I hear you.
Well, me and Kathy are on.
Well, see, I have a black screen.
Just a second. I think something's going on. Just one second.
Remember, you had me muted, and then when it finished, then it was gone.
I'm gonna start this over. I'm so sorry.
That's all right. We're all learning, aren't we?
Just give me 1 minute.
Can you guys hear me already?
Give me 1 second, Manuel. I'm sorry.
Oh,
Just 1 second.
oh.
Can you even see me?
No, I can't see Kathy.
No. See, yeah, it's really interesting. It's modern technology. Are the rest of you there too?
We're here. We're in a breakup.
Kathy, is that you?
Well, I moved to paper,
Okay, no, you have to accept the other.
but there's nothing. I can't do anything.
Okay.
It's just
You
black.
should receive something.
I mean, should I even push the
You
close
should
button?
accept the invitation to
What
join.
was
the
that?
room.
What was that again?
You should accept, it should ask, say something like, you are requested to join another room.
Oh, the only thing I can do is push the button here and see if it goes away or what it does. Should I try it?
Yes.
Okay, I'm back to my start. It's nothing to do with council. Are you gone?
No, I'm here.
Yeah, I don't know how to do that then. There's nothing else. Says software update will be automatically installed, available, install later.
Are still here. Gilbert, are you there?
Huh.
I'm right here, Yasmina.
Yeah, you should have received something saying to join the next room.
I did, but then it came up with a time. There was a rolling time. I mean, it was on close.
Okay, you should have something on there. It just says that you haven't joined.
You know,
Let's see here, share, right? Because I was with Chad and let me see. Give me one second. Let's see what this show. Yeah, connection is.
Oh my God. Oh my gosh.
Screen invite others. Link.
Well, I don't know.
I'm not able to put you in that room. You have to join the room yourself.
Okay, join. I have join audio connection.
Yes.
Join.
Try doing that. See what that does.
Okay.
No.
Leaving computer. No. You know what? I'm back. I think. Leave computer.
Okay, Kathy's in, so they're just waiting for you, Gilbert.
Okay. Leave computer. Let's see here. Yasmina.
Yes.
Yasmina.
Yes, I'm here. You should have.
I haven't yet. It says phone call, computer, audio connection.
You don't see anything that says join breakout room?
No. Join, okay, hold on, breakout room. Join breakout room.
Gilbert, you still there? Gilbert, are you still there? Oh, for the record, Mayor Alvarado has joined closed session.
Good.
Hi, Manuel. I think we're just waiting.
For who? For Gilbert?
No, I think you should
For
all.
Kathy. Kathy, oh, there she is.
All right.
There you go.
Okay. Are we all here?
Yo, yo.
Yep.
All right. Like we're all here. Counselor Marcos.
Yes, Mayor, thank you. Earlier tonight, the City
Sid-
Council
Sid-
recessed into closed session. The items are listed on the special meeting agenda. There were 2 items on tonight's agenda, and all council members were present. There was threat to public services pursuant to Government Code Section 54957. There was also a conference with labor negotiators concerning the groups listed on the agenda. With respect to both items, there is no reportable action, Mayor. That concludes our report.
Thank you very much. Can I get a motion to adjourn, please?
I'll make a motion.
I'll second.
We have a motion by Mayor Pro Temp Lopez and second by Councilmember Gibbons to adjourn. All in favor?
Aye.
All right.
Aye. Good. Thank you.
Have a
Y'all
good
take
one.
care.
Everyone have a good
Be
night.
safe.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.